Disagreements are common in poker, but when the person you're talking to has over 2 million in cash game winnings and charges $1,000 an hour for coaching, then it's probably best to shut up and take the free advice. This is the story of how I disagreed with a high-stakes crusher, how the discussion got nasty at one point, as well as what we can all take away from it. It all started with a friendly wager on the 2+2 forums. Two players, Dudu and Wampy, disagreed on how a certain hand was played. In order to determine who was correct, they got a bunch of coaches, such as myself, to vote on what the best play was. Here's the hand in question. Hero raises under the gun with ace-queen offsuit, only to face a 3-bet from middle position. A recreational player cold calls on the button, and it folds back to us. If we could only choose between 4-betting and calling, which play is the higher EV option? Dudu's position was that calling is the superior play. He argued that since ace-queen is 0 EV to 4-bet in a heads-up situation, the inclusion of the cold caller cannot possibly make 4-betting plus EV. This is because we have decreased fold equity once the fish cold calls, and a borderline hand like ace-queen offsuit greatly relies on folds to generate EV. On the other hand, Wampy argued that some of our EV also comes from the times that we get called. And if the assumption is that we barely have any fold equity, then it also means that at least one player is calling the 4-bet very wide. This should make us even more inclined to 4-bet with ace-queen, since we get to build the pot against plenty of dominated hands. My first instinct was that 4-betting had to be better. Wampy's argument made a lot of sense to me, not to mention playing a 3-way pot out of position with ace-queen offsuit felt downright awful. But I decided to take a look at the other responses before casting my vote. By this time, 4 other coaches had already responded. 2 of them preferred calling, and the other 2 preferred 4-betting. An even split. One of these coaches was Jazer, a former high-stakes regular who played up to 40k NL. Surprisingly, he preferred calling. You can pause the video if you want to read his full response, but the gist of it is that 4-betting ace-queen doesn't accomplish much against what is likely a polarized 3-betting range. With the fish behind, middle position should be flatting hands like ace-queen and pocket tens against our under-the-gun open. This shifts his 3-bet bluffs to ace-jack and king-queen offsuit, hands that don't have a lot of equity against ace-queen. All else equal, this makes us more inclined to defend by calling, since we don't deny as much equity when we 4-bet. Basically, Jazer is saying that we shouldn't treat this like a typical MP versus UTG spot, where MP is playing 3-bet or fold. Instead, it plays closer to button 3-bet versus UTG. Looking at UTG's response versus a 3-bet, we do in fact call wider against the button. Even though button is 3-betting about 1% less often than MP, UTG is still able to flat more hands because button's 3-betting range is more polarized. There are more weak hands like king-9 suited and ace-jack offsuit, and less strong hands like ace-king since button is flatting them at some frequency. This gives every hand in UTG's range slightly better equity and makes calling a little more reasonable. On the other hand, against a strong and linear middle position 3-bet, calling isn't a great option. There are less low equity bluffs in MP's range, as well as a ton of hands that have a tough decision facing a 4-bet. So with a hand like ace-queen offsuit, our strategy shifts towards 4-bet or fold. As logical as this might sound, I wasn't completely convinced. After all, button 3-betting a polarized range doesn't make calling better than 4-betting. It merely makes us indifferent to both options. Not to mention the 3-bet size in the actual hand is half a big blind larger, which is generally something that makes us more inclined to 4-bet. You could argue that the fish cold calling a wide range increases the EV of calling. But then again, it also increases the EV of 4-betting. And it's hard to say for sure which increases more. So after mulling it over, I gave the following response. I skimmed through the thread and 1P actually makes a lot of good points, especially the point that we don't need to deny much equity if we think our equity when called is good enough. Basically, I think there are very few scenarios where calling makes sense. If the fish is cold calling a relatively tight range, then ace-queen offsuit should just be folding. If he's cold calling very wide, then ace-queen just becomes a clear value 4-bet. Conceptually, this spot works the same way as when we defend the big blind against a single open. Here, ace-queen offsuit mixes between 3-bet and call, and we even flat ace-king sometimes. But the moment you throw in a cold caller, ace-king and ace-queen both become pure squeezes. The fact is, whether we are facing a single raise or a 3-bet, the presence of cold callers heavily incentivizes us to fast play our thin value holdings. You can think of 3-betting a hand like ace-queen as a trade-off. On one hand, we lose a bigger pot the times we run into queens plus ace-king. But against the rest of villain's range, we are either flipping or ahead. This gives us plenty of incentive to 3-bet, regardless of how villain might respond. If he calls, then we are simply building the pot against worse hands and pushing a small equity edge. If he folds, then we are denying equity. Even a hand like king-queen offsuit has 25% equity against us, so getting a fold is definitely not a bad result. Against a single open, these two factors usually balance each other out, leading to a situation where ace-queen is indifferent. Or, in the case of a UTG open, the increased likelihood of running into queens plus ace-king makes calling a slightly better option. But throw in one or more cold callers, and ace-queen becomes a slam dunk 3-bet. This is because cold calling ranges are capped. Queens plus ace-king typically gets 3-bet at some frequency, which skews the calling range towards weaker hands. So while the risk of running into a better hand stays about the same, we now have much more reason to 3-bet and push our equity edge against the cold caller. The same principle applies when we are facing a 3-bet instead of an open. Here, calling and 4-betting are both slightly minus EV because the range we are up against is much stronger. But throw in a wide cold calling range, and it's entirely possible that ace-queen becomes a plus EV 4-bet. We don't see this in the solver because its cold calling range is quite strong with a big chunk of hands that are ahead of ace-queen. But as Dudu himself points out, a 55 VPIP fish is not going to be cold calling a solver range. Instead, there are going to be way more hands like low pocket pairs and suited connectors, all of which dilute the proportion of queens plus ace-king. And just like before, this gives us plenty of incentive to 4-bet and push our equity edge against the cold caller. As an analogy, imagine if you come across a cave with some treasure in it. There is a dragon guarding the cave, and the only way to get past it is to pay a small entry fee. Unfortunately, there are a bunch of other people who know about the cave as well. So if you do decide to pay the fee, you'll probably have to split the treasure among multiple people. Alternatively, you could offer the dragon a bigger bribe and instruct it to block off the entrance. This way, no one else can enter the cave, and you get to keep the treasure all for yourself. In this analogy, paying the entry fee is akin to calling the 3-bet with ace-queen. It's the safer play in the sense that you risk a lot less, but the potential payoff is much smaller as well. On the other hand, bribing the dragon would be the equivalent of 4-betting. Even though you take on more risk, the potential upside is also much higher since you don't have to split the treasure with anyone else. For smaller amounts of treasure, neither option is particularly good. Whether you pay the small entry fee or the bigger bribe, there simply isn't enough treasure for you to recoup your investment. But as the amount of treasure increases, the EV of bribing the dragon goes up far more rapidly than the EV of paying the entry fee. This is because the first option scales directly with the amount of treasure, while the second option is proportional to the amount of treasure divided by the number of players you have to split it with. You can see the problem with calling now. If button's range is tight, then we are better off folding ace-queen. If button's range is wide, then we benefit more from 4-betting and trying to isolate him. So there's really not a whole lot of situations where calling is likely to be the best play. One of the other coaches in the thread ran a note lock sim just to see how the solver would respond against a loose cold caller. This is the range he assigned button. You can see it's quite a bit wider than the GTO range, with all sorts of hands like small pocket pairs and ace-x suited that the solver would just fold. Upon resolving, he found that UTG actually started to 4-bet ace-queen at some frequency, and that calling remained a poor option with an EV loss of a quarter of a big blind. Of course, as the coach himself emphasized, there are a couple of issues with the sim. The 3-bet size in the actual hand was half a big blind smaller, which definitely favors calling. The actual stack sizes were also slightly deeper, which, for a hand like ace-queen, probably hurts 4-betting a little bit more than it does calling. But at the very least, it shows that it is in fact possible for the 4-bet to go from minus EV to plus EV, provided the cold calling range is wide enough. So regardless of which option is actually better, we can say for sure that Dudu's reason for calling is wrong. That is, having less fold equity doesn't necessarily decrease the EV of 4-betting, as long as our hand has decent equity when called. Unfortunately, Dudu wasn't convinced by my argument. He advised me to reread what I wrote and said that I was incorrectly putting the cold caller on a tight range. A few of the other guys were quick to point out that this wasn't what I was saying at all, and as you can see, some of their responses were quite hilarious. I definitely recommend checking out the thread, not just because it's entertaining, but also because it has some serious educational value. In total, there were 6 coaches who responded, all of whom are great poker minds. Even though the final result was a wash, reading through the opposing arguments made me realize that the situation is way more complex than I thought. So even though I still think 4-betting is the best play, I no longer feel as strongly about it as before. What do you think? Let me know in the comments whether you prefer calling or 4-betting, and whether this video played a part in changing your mind.